All right, hello and welcome everyone. So today I wanted to talk about what is becoming one of our favorite topics to talk about here, which is the public sector loan forgiveness program, and just student loan planning in general. What prompted me to talk about this is not only the fact that I've had 3 conversations about this exact topic with folks over the past week, but also an inquiry I received from a private student loan lender who refinances student loans to make money about the viability of the public sector loan forgiveness program in the long term. This is a fear that I hear a lot from borrowers. There's a lot of uncertainty that people have about it, and so I wanted to spend some time talking about this. I linked to the to the document that I was sent by this lender, who essentially had found a post that I had done on public sector loan forgiveness on my website in the past, asked me to link to the article. I get these requests quite often. Usually don't act on them, but in particular, I thought I wanted to talk about this one a little bit because, first and foremost, I thought, generally speaking, it was actually a pretty good guide. They got their facts right about how the program works and what qualifies and what doesn't, which is not a given when people talk about a complicated program like this. But about halfway down through the article, you'll see that there's a section called, can you really get public sector loan forgiveness? To which my answer, just to be clear, is unequivocally, yes, you can. If you take your time to do the homework you need to, or have somebody like me doing the homework for you, to make sure you're actually set up and good to go on this program. And just taking a step back, right? Public sector loan forgiveness, what's it all about? You probably are aware if this is something that's of interest to you. But long story short, the federal government in October 2007 instituted this program as a way to encourage people to sign up for jobs in government or public service, essentially offering, if you work for them for 10 years, for either a government or nonprofit agency, they'll forgive the balance of your student loans after that point in time. But again, right, this started in 2007, during the later years of the George W. Bush administration. That was a long time ago. It's a 10-year program, which means that the first people actually eligible for forgiveness under this program submitted their applications in late 2017, right, 10 years after it started. As of this recording, that was only a little bit over a year ago. Right, so the government's been promising this program for 10 years. Nobody's been eligible because it hadn't been 10 years old yet. And there was a lot of fear that I was hearing from people who were counting on this program before we actually reached the point where the first people were eligible for forgiveness, that this promise wasn't going to be offered, right, or the promise wasn't going to be honored for people. There was a lot of fear about it. There were several issues that led to a lot of negative press once the first people actually were able to apply for forgiveness, because a lot of the early people who applied for this program unfortunately didn't get the fine print right. And so a lot of the press about this program in late 2017, early 2018 was that a lot of people were getting rejected, unfortunately. And unfortunately, this was a little bit foreseeable looking at the industry data. But it's a complicated program that you need to make sure you're actually eligible for and or get yourself eligible if you're going to count on it. So to that point, that this particular article that I referenced, touches on this kind of fear mongering a little bit. They referenced that as of the date this was written, less than 100 people had actually had their loans forgiven. And I'll actually throw out another study by the GAO conducted last year that 99% of the applicants for public sector loan forgiveness got denied in the first year. But though, the key thing for you to realize is that that's not a failure of the government to honor the promises they made. It's that there's a lot of fine print in the promises you need to make sure you're sticking with, and that you're actually following to the letter in order to have your loans forgiven. If you do that, you're not going to have a problem under this program. Period. Full stop. Right. Unfortunately, it wasn't rolled out very well by the government. Shocker, I know. Right. The program requirements were very, very vague, particularly in the early days. They didn't do a very good job promulgating the specific requirements they were looking for. And there have been a lot of changes to student loan policy since then. During the Obama administration, I believe there was a major change in how student loans were structured every 2.5 or 3 years. Things have changed a lot since then, which has just made it even more confusing and even more difficult to know whether or not you're actually on track to qualify. Second of all, the student loan servicers who process the payments, there's one in particular that you should make sure that your loans are serviced by, if you're qualifying, or if you're looking to qualify for PSLF. They make a lot of mistakes. Literally, since January 1st of this year, over the past 3.5 weeks, I've dealt with 3 different people who have had errors in their loans, or in their loan payments as calculated by the loan servicers. They unfortunately, right, the quality of their work is not where it should be, in my opinion. But if you work with them, they will help you resolve it. And unfortunately, right, for people who were applying for this or hoping to apply for this public sector loan forgiveness program, if the servicer makes a mistake or doesn't catch something in their application, unfortunately, that there hasn't been historically liability on their end, although there are a few class action lawsuits out there that may change that at some point in the future. And finally, right, the other thing contributing to these low numbers of people who were actually approved over the first year or so is that just not many borrowers were eligible in the early years of this program, right? As every year goes by, right, more and more people are actually going to be eligible to apply for forgiveness on this program, right? So for all of those reasons, I'm not terribly concerned with the relatively high rejection rate for people who are applying for this right now. I mean, to be clear, I'm very much bothered by it because, again, I don't think it was set up effectively for people to be able to easily make sure they know whether or not they qualify or not. But if you actually do take those steps to make sure you are on track to qualify, you really shouldn't have an issue. I'm not terribly concerned that the government's going to go back on this promise at this point, right? Their terms of the program are written into your loan documents. You have it in writing from them. That this is going to be something that will work for you, right? Unfortunately, I see too many people who think they're on track for this, but are disqualified from the beginning because they fail to meet at least one of the 3 criteria for this program, right? There are 3 things you need to do, and it is a very, very valid concern that you should have to make sure that you're actually following through on all 3 of them and that you check all 3 of the boxes. Right? The solution isn't to say, to try to convince people that public sector loan forgiveness doesn't work, like this article seems to try to scare people into thinking, but rather to make sure you actually qualify for the program. And so to take a minute or two to walk through what that is, right? There are 3 things you need to make sure that you have. First and foremost, eligible loans. This one the article touches on. They reference that it can be challenging to meet the requirements of public sector loan forgiveness, especially if it turns out you have a loan type that doesn't qualify. I'll actually take it a step further, right? If you have a loan that doesn't qualify, you won't meet the requirements and you won't be able to get it. But that doesn't mean you can't, right? It means you need to, as soon as you set yourself on track to get this 10-year loan forgiveness, you need to make sure that the loans you have actually qualify for the program, period. I have a student loan guide that'll walk you through exactly what all those are. You can feel free to download that. The link will be in the description once we're done here. But you need to make sure that the loans you have qualify. Particularly, I guess I'll give you a couple things to look out for. If you borrowed loans before 2010, if you have older student loans that were issued before during and before 2010, and if you have any Perkins loans that were a specific type of federal student loans. There aren't that many of them anymore, but they're pretty common over the last decade or so. If you have either of those, you need to make sure that you consolidate your loans into a newer loan in order to qualify, right? But that's the first step, right? Make sure you have loans that qualify for the program. Step 2, make sure that you're on an eligible payment plan for the student loans. They talk in here a little bit about people who are on deferment or forbearance and how that doesn't qualify, but that's a reason that they're saying that public sector loan forgiveness might not actually be viable for you. No, you need to make sure you're on a correct payment plan. I've spoken with a medical resident, for example, who, if you're not familiar with medical residency, they typically have very low incomes in the first 2 years of their career, right? They work at nonprofit hospitals, so they qualify. And so often I hear people say, oh, well, I'm just going to put my loans into deferment or forbearance and not make any payments during this 3-year residency, and then all of a sudden I'm 3 years into the 10-year forgiveness requirement, right? It doesn't work that way. It's actually not a 10-year forgiveness requirement at all. It's a 120 payment requirement. And just so happens if you make one payment a month for 10 years, that brings you to 120 payments, but you do need to actually make these payments on a qualifying payment plan. Some sort of income-driven repayment plan will work. That's, you need to make sure you're on one of them in order to qualify for the program. Deferment and forbearance won't work. If you're on just a standard 10-year repayment plan, technically it would qualify, but if you make standard payments for 10 years, there's not going to be anything for you to forgive at the end, unless you went into deferment or something like that. And it can work in some circumstances, but for the most part, you want to make sure you're on a qualifying income-driven repayment plan. If you are, right, that's the easiest way to make sure you stay on track. Now, actually choosing the right income-driven repayment plans, there are 5 of them, is probably the subject for another video, because I find that I mentioned that the quality of work at some of these student loan servicers isn't great all the time. I often find that they don't put people on the optimal income-driven repayment plan for them unless you really push them to. But right, make sure you're on at least one of them so that you're making qualifying payments. As soon as you get on one of those plans with a qualifying loan, you'll start that 120 payment clock for forgiveness, as long as you're meeting the 3rd requirement, which is that you have a qualifying job that counts as a job that would make you eligible for this forgiveness program. I'm even just going to read the requirements as they're laid out. Qualifying employment must be a full-time position, either as defined by your employer or over 30 hours, where you're employed by the government, employed by a not-for-profit agency that is a 501c3 organization as classified by the IRS. Again, it's a 501c3 nonprofit. Or you work for the AmeriCorps, a Peace Corps, or any other kind of employment at a public service organization that is not a political in nature or a labor union. So again, I know that's a lot, right? We'll have this up in the article when it goes up on the site. But you need to, full-time position with the government, not a 501c3 nonprofit, either AmeriCorps or the Peace Corps, and then finally employment at a public service organization that is not a political in nature or a labor union. If you have a position like that, right, you can and should qualify. There is an employment certification form you should be submitting every year to have your employer sign off on that demonstrates that you actually did have a qualifying position. And long story short, if you do that, you make sure your payments are counting, right, because your loans are eligible, you have you're on the right repayment plan, you file in this form every year to show your job qualifies. If you do this, right, you will get public sector loan forgiveness, right, period. There's a lot of these scare tactics out there that call into question the nature of the program and whether or not it's actually going to work. Unfortunately, the issues that we've had with it are that people weren't qualified for one of those 3 tests, right? But if you are, you're going to be okay. I feel pretty good in saying that right now. If you're not, if one of those 3 issues, right, the loan payments, the payment plan, the loan type, or your job might not qualify, you need to look into that now to make sure that it actually is. And if not, you need to correct whatever it is. There are solutions for all 3 of these things, but you need to make sure you're on top of it. Now, finally, the last thing that this article talks about that I think is worth referencing here is they talk about future changes that Congress could make that might eliminate the public sector loan forgiveness program. I actually think this is somewhat likely. I think it's very likely that 5 years from now we're going to look back and this program is not going to look exactly like it is today. President Obama, a handful of years ago, seriously talked about putting at least limits on it and maybe eliminating it for grad schools, period. And he also talked about forcing, if you're married, you and your spouse to report your incomes together rather than giving you the ability to separate it. Didn't go through, obviously, but it was seriously talked about a few years ago. The Trump administration has talked about similar restrictions to the program. This article in particular references the Prosper Act, which would completely eliminate the program. The key, though, for all of those things is if you already have your loans and are already making payments, they will not affect you, right? All of these potential changes are for new borrowers only. All that's to say, if you're in college right now and are thinking about going to med school and working for a nonprofit hospital to pursue this program, I would be cautious if I were you before you actually take the loans out, because I do think that for new borrowers, there will be some changes to this program. In fact, I can almost promise there will be over the next handful of years. But again, right, the way student loan changes operate, I'm not an attorney, but every student loan change that's been made over the past decade or so has only affected new borrowers. A lot of these forgiveness terms are written into your contracts with the government. Right, so it's not something they can just wave a wand and have it go away. Right, they do have legal obligations. Again, right, all the changes that actually have been talked about have been for new borrowers. And again, so if you're already making loan payments toward public sector loan forgiveness, I would not worry too much about this. I really wouldn't. Unfortunately, there are articles like this one that tap into the fear that a lot of people have about this program, because it is there are very high stakes for it. But ultimately, I would not worry right now. What you should be worried about is making sure that you're qualifying as the program stands today. Right, pull your loan data, make sure that your loans qualify, make sure that you're on the right repayment plan. If you already are, then you want to make sure that the loan servicers are tracking, that you've made a certain number of months payments toward the public sector loan forgiveness program. Again, the student loan guide will tell you how to do that. You can do that on your own. I'm certainly happy to help as well. If you're interested in talking more about this, feel free to set up an intro call with me at pacesetterplanning.com/contact. But again, ultimately, right, I will link to this article as I was requested to. Not sure they're going to be happy I'm doing it now in this context. But again, right, there are these scare tactics out there. Because there have been talk of changes to the program in the future, I think it's easy to interpret that's going to affect you if you're already working toward the program. It's not going to. And ultimately, finally, like the last point I want to make about this is keep in mind where you're reading these things from. This particular article, for example, is a private student loan lender, right? Private student loans are not eligible for the program. If you don't have them right now, that's great. You don't need to worry about it, but you can refinance your loans into a private program, right? The company that sent me this article makes their money by taking loans that are public sector loan forgiveness eligible and refinancing them into loans that aren't, which is what particularly irritated me about this, to be honest, right? The people, you should not be refinancing your loans if you are looking to get loan forgiveness under public sector loan forgiveness, right? It's for that reason that I think that this, these kind of fear mongering in this article is particularly irritating to me. Unfortunately, it's all too common. There are a lot of very good, reputable student loan sites that make their money by refinancing people out of this program. Right? That's what you should be concerned about if you're looking to qualify, right? Making sure that your loans are eligible by not refinancing using a service like this. And then also, like I said, making sure you're on the right repayment plan and making sure that your employment is coming. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to set up a quick intro call with me at pacesetterplanning.com/contact. Thanks so much for tuning in today, and I will talk to you next time. Thanks.